the Japanese box, and other stories. Joining me today, as always, is my Vox Vomitus vixen, Allison Martine, author of The Bourbon Books, which includes Dibs Since September, Move on Melinda, and Climb the Salmon Ladder. Joining us today from the wilds of Massachusetts is Bracken MacLeod, here to talk about all things writing, but also his book Closing Costs, which Allison and I binge read over the weekend. Oh, and binge listened.
I haven't. You know, it's funny. I haven't heard the audiobook. They let me listen to audition tapes from the readers and have a say on which one I thought was best. And they went with the woman who I thought did, you know, sort of the best job in her audition. But I haven't heard the whole book. It's so I hope it was
great. It was great. Your narrator nailed it. So
yay!
I find it's very funny because the number of people we've talked to who are like, yeah, I actually haven't listened to my book, and I'm like, wouldn't you immediately? And then I realize going ahead and listening to your own stuff has to be just cringy.
I haven't listened to mine. I get embarrassed.
I listen to yours.
It's crazy difficult. It is.
I got like a chapter in, and I'm like, I'm gonna have a panic attack. I can't do it. Because then I'm also like, I should have written that line better. Like, that's weird.
That, or it's like, that's not how I meant it to be delivered, because I know there were lines, not necessarily in this book, but there are sometimes I hear lines in a book and I go, you know, if I were the narrator, I would have delivered it slightly differently, because sometimes you wonder if that's what the author intended. Like, it comes across straight and maybe it should have been kind of humorous, and you never really know, did they ask the narrator, how is this supposed to be? Or they're just doing their own interpretation come hell or high water, or
the only questions that a narrator, an audiobook narrator has ever sent to me are usually pronunciation questions.
Yeah.
How do you pronounce this name? How do you pronounce this place? And especially since, you know, almost all my books are set in Massachusetts. There's a lot of how do you pronounce this place.
Yeah, I know, Billerica. No, it's Billerica.
It killed I forget the actress's name, the woman who played Captain Janeway on Voyager. Or not Voyager. Yeah. Anyways, she narrated Joe Hill's Nosferatu.
Oh.
And there's a whole bunch of
name's Kate something, and I'm blanking on her last name right now.
Yeah, I can't remember it.
Yeah, and Nosferatu is just filled with like the worst New England town names possible.
A whole bunch of takes place in Haverhill.
Yeah.
And
you mean Haverhill?
And every time she pronounces it Haverhill. And my wife, you know, listens to audiobooks when she drives in to work, and she's just like
writing
every time. Yeah, but it's not her fault. She's from California. If nobody tells her it's Haverhill.
Well, and I was going to say, Bracken, you've got one of the recurring things in the book is Nell's last name is Pereira, and they're saying it like pariah and all sorts of things. So if they aren't saying it correctly the first time, the narrator would literally have to go back to the first time it was said and get all of those takes corrected. Because I do know I follow one of the narrators who I just love, Natalie Natus, and she will, or maybe her last name is Natus, I don't even know that, but she will be like, oh, when the author says on page 300 that this guy has a Russian accent, which wasn't done before, and she's like, I will kill you, I will find you, and I will kill you. We have to go back and put the Russian accent in from the beginning.
That actually was a really pleasant surprise on a different novel I wrote called Stranded. Which is a sci-fi horror novel set in the Arctic, but there's a character in that book who I wrote with the intention of him being Quebecois, you know, sort of francophone. But you know, all of his dialogue is in English. But his name is Serge, and no one ever asked me. But the narrator on that book, he just assumed he was going to have this Quebecois accent. And so he gave it to him. And I was like, what? Yes!
You did it!
So I'd have to go and go, it's not Surge.
Yeah, exactly.
Surge Protector.
He nailed it so wonderfully. So anyway, so I'm glad to hear that the narrator on Closing Costs was great.
That is awesome. And I know we kind of jumped right into the whole like interview of it all. Bracken, before we get too far into your beer and my Sazerac and the interview, tell our viewers a little bit about who you are.
Oh, okay. You know, I'm that guy who was terrible at everything he ever did until he started writing.
That's a great endorsement.
You know, my past is littered with the debris of other careers. So, you know, I started out, I used to be a martial arts instructor. And then I taught philosophy at Colorado State University for a while as an adjunct for a very short time. Went to law school, and I spent about 11 years practicing law.
I know, I'm like, you and Allison have something in common.
There we go. And then and then quit so that I could be a full-time writer and a stay-at-home dad, which was the best decision I ever made, because those are the only two jobs
except
actually
not
really
that. Mom.
I know, we get a lot of former lawyers on this show, I think.
There's a reason we're all former, you know?
Yeah,
I mean, I know
that's the saying. Scratch a lawyer, find a writer, you know? I tell people it's sort of a natural progression from lawyer to writer, especially if you're a litigator, because, no jury in America is ever swayed by raw fact. You could tell people like 2 + 2 is 4, therefore you must rule that 4 is the answer. And
they'd be like, except when it might be 5.
On a jury, he goes, but I like the guy with the 5 better.
He's more likable.
Yeah, and so the whole profession is about storytelling. It's about creating a narrative that 6 or 12 people can identify with, and apply that kind of I hesitate to say prejudice, but apply that kind of affinity, right, for the story you've told to the facts. But yeah, no, the idea that a trial is a search for truth is one of the biggest fictions.
Bracken, that's on the X-Files. If we're searching for the truth, it's up there.
If you want truth, I don't know, go to an archaeology class or something. But
yes. Well, and I was enjoying. I was looking at your website because I did the little banner down below, and so I always look at the website first. And I laughed so hard because I love this term, but I want to know what you mean by it. But you list yourself as an author and a horror secularist, and I'm like
secular horrorist.
And instead of like a faithful horrorist, like, because for me that's the diversion, faith versus secular, or religiosity versus, and I was assuming it meant basically horror without a supernatural element.
That's pretty much exactly it. It's naturalistic.
I never heard that term. And I know that people don't like horror that doesn't have that extra. So horror secular.
Yeah. When I'm doing this stuff, I tend to go in more of a Jack Ketchum direction than a Stephen King one.
Yeah.
Right. And there are occasions, like I said, Stranded is a supernatural, sort of sci-fi horror. But I think of, although they plug it as a novel of suspense.
I know. I was like, thank you for telling me it was a novel of suspense. I never would have known.
Even though they put that on the cover, I think of this as a horror novel because it's in the same vein as, sort of your traditional home invasion.
It is.
Horror.
Yeah. And we've got ourselves like a pretty kick-ass final girl.
Yeah. That was.
And I was like, this gave me Halloween vibes.
And I was joking as far as the title. The reason they put it's like a horror or it's suspense is because people are gonna so it's about getting a home mortgage, because I mean that's
it's a real estate book.
But people are dumb, and if they're just clicking on Amazon and they type in how to learn about closing costs, they get your book and they're like, this is not what I was looking for.
This is not.
This is like, oh gosh, I never want to move to the suburbs.
It's funny because. If you called this a horror novel, I would get a ton of people who would be upset because there's no monster. I mean, no supernatural monster.
As I say, there's a monster.
Right, there's a monster. Yeah, there's a couple in there, but there's no supernatural element. And, so of course you get those people who are sort of purists, genre purists, who feel like if it's not supernatural, it's not horror. And that's fine. They're entitled to that.
And I've had people say to me, like, I have like a ghost element in one of my books or two of my books, and they're just like, well, it still wasn't horror just because there's a ghost in it. I wasn't scared. And I'm like, you don't know what horror is.
That's just subjective. I wasn't scared, so it's not horror. That's you projecting on the material. And again, that's their experience with the book, but that's not that doesn't mean that it's misclassified.
Yeah. Well, then it's like
I saw a friend of mine online. I think he was just sort of shit posting and trying to be controversial. And what was his take? He had a hot take, which was, if it has a happy ending, it's not horror. I think was it. And of course it's
define happy.
Yeah, exactly. Define happy. And all these things, and it was just it was reductive in a way that I was like, I disagree, but everybody has an idea about what it is. I think it's a big tent, and a lot of different things fit under the horror penumbra. But
yeah, because Closing Costs was definitely horrifying to me. Home invasions, like I'm just so petrified, and I'm more petrified now that I live out in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
You live in that house almost with like the no neighbors, and I could stand in the middle of the road and scream, "There's still no one here."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's like all I could think after like reading it for the past couple days. Like I was turning off the lights last night and I just like stared out into my dark yard and I'm like, my weirdo Republican neighbors could be about to break in any moment.
Okay, and Regina wants to know, is there a horror novel that attempts to define happiness? And I don't quite know.
That's life, Regina.
Yeah, life. But I mean, when I think about happiness in terms of an ending, I think more of the romance genre where they require a happily ever after. Otherwise, it is a fiction or even a tragedy with a romance element or a love story. Like anybody who thinks Romeo and Juliet is a romance is confused. That's a tragedy. But there will be people who will still argue on that. But I've never heard horror needing to have a specific ending because you can defeat the beast or not defeat the beast. It's still horror because there is a beast, human or otherwise.
Oh, Bracken, we can't hear you.
We lost you. One sec. And I'll read Regina's question. Or does horror in some way by the nature of the drama define happiness? Oh, no, she says drama was supposed to be genre. So does horror by some way by the nature of the genre define happiness?
Oh, my bad.
You heard it? You're cutting out.
Oh, technology.
I don't like technology.
Here, let me.
We can hear you.
Oh, you're good.
Okay, great.
Bracken's back.
Bracken's back.
Bracken's back.
Release the Bracken. I said I wasn't going to do it. I did it anyway.
We made it 12 minutes in before Release the Bracken came out.
As a romance is it's hilarious because it's very clearly a tragedy. It's two teenagers fall in love and in the course of a long weekend get 6 different people killed before killing themselves. It's the feel good story of the of all time. Exactly, but it's got some pretty words in it, so it must be romantic. I think the whole idea of happiness in horror, I think is I think horror requires a certain amount of happiness because that has to be disrupted. Yes. Right. What gives us pleasure and what brings us enough joy in order to maintain sanity in a in a really rough world is the thing that's under assault in a horror novel, right? And part of this, I think, is why horror often is such a conservative genre, because it's really about trying to restore the status quo. We were happy before, and here comes this big disruptive thing, and in order to be happy again, we must return to the past. That's why Clive Barker's work was so transformative for me as a writer, because his work was the first time I read something where we were happy in the past, but here comes this big giant monster, and at the end, everything's changed, and we must redefine who we are, what life is like, because that disruption is transformative, and that's what I tried to do in Closing Costs. Is I hate it when there are no consequences to a story that's as traumatic as a hotel keeper goes crazy and hatchets his whole family to death, and then
that sounds familiar.
It sounds familiar, right? But if the sequel is just like, oh well, mother and son grew up happy and healthy and well adjusted, then you didn't read Dr. Sleep. Right. Now King didn't do that. Dr. Sleep has a lot of consequences for Danny as an adult. But that's the kind of thing that I dislike in storytelling. It's part of the reason that I don't do any series or sequels, is just because the people in the books I write end up so traumatized that
you're like, I don't want to even deal with you.
Yeah, no, the book 2 would just necessarily have to be like therapy, the novel.
Right.
Nobody needs that. I mean, people need therapy, but they don't need to read.
Nobody needs to read that.
Yeah. I have to ask. So I read your afterword in Closing Costs, or the author notes, and you talked about the emotional toll it took on you to write characters that were so similar to you and your wife. Was she upset about all of this?
No, actually, no. She, my wife is super supportive of my career as a writer and all of that, and she was really into it because it was easy for her to connect with these characters right away. Other people not so much, because I think I did put a lot of shorthand. They're not a one-to-one correlation between me and her. Her name is Heather. Between me and Heather, there's a little bit of Evan in both of us, a little bit of Nell in both of us, and that's what kind of made it really hard to write. Is you spend 6-7 hours a day, as long as my son is at school, is when I work, thinking about the worst possible thing that could happen to you and your family.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the day, Heather comes home and our son comes home, and I'm like, happy times, my family, but it's still in my head.
You're like, oh, I shouldn't have.
Please, hurt you.
I always get really.
What would it be like? And it's funny because Closing Costs was a reaction to the other book, Stranded, where I had to do a ton of research because I didn't know anything about the oil industry or maritime shipping or the Arctic, and I just had to really, really go deep on all of these things. And I said, well, the next book I write, I don't want to do any research. I just want
it to take place in my neighborhood.
Exactly. So I'm going to set
house.
it literally in my house. Like the book is my house, and I'm going to set it in my house, and I'm going to base the main characters off of me and my wife, and then it'll be so easy because there's no research. And no, it was the opposite. It was so just
the opposite way.
Yeah, it was nightmare inducing. I lose sleep over it, and so. But I look at the end of the day, the book is. I love the book. And a lot of other people seem to dig it all as well. But
yes.
It was hard. It was hard work to throw so much of myself into it and kind of live in that headspace. There are moments in the book like when. They're in the basement, and Nell's kind of scooching the chair to see if she can get to the point. I did that. So I'm like, I wonder how hard that would be. So I went down to the basement.
You're like, honey, can you tape me to a chair?
And grabbed my shitty IKEA chair and kind of like gripped it really hard and kind of hopped over to the wine rack. I was like, oh yeah, okay, she can do this. She can do this.
That's and one of the things I cracked up at is I'm assuming it's an Easter egg that Nell works for a particular funeral home with a certain name, and I'm like, hi, Tremblay Mortuary.
But it's also, yeah. At first I was like, Tremblay Mortuary. Oh, it's after Paul. And then once I realized it was Tony Tremblay, I'm like, no, that's just very clearly Tony.
That's funny.
I was like, did he win a contest or?
No. Tony features in another book. The same character, Tony Tremblay, the mortician.
Nice.
He's in another book that I wrote called Come to Dust, which is about dead kids that come back to life. And
uplifting.
And so, exactly. And so there's a scene.
I'm like, that sounds like a Jennifer Ann Gordon book right there.
Right? And so I cast Tony in it. As just kind of a little homage to my friend. The funny thing was, at the exact same time, he was writing a book called The Moore House. And the main character in The Moore House is this Catholic priest whose last name is MacLeod, father. And poor Tony, because what I did in my book was Tony is a source of comfort and support for the people in this book. He's a sweet, kind person, just like the real Tony.
I was going to say, he is.
Exactly. But in his book, he made MacLeod a whoring, drunk.
I resemble that remark.
And so he felt guilty. He's like, oh,
it's like, sorry, I made you a total shit in my book.
Exactly. The best part of it is
we do it in one-to-one swap there, did we?
Yeah, no, it wasn't quite one-to-one. But the best part of that is if whenever he does a reading with Father MacLeod describing the character, it's not comedy. See, it's not written to be funny. But if I'm in the room, everyone's laughing.
You're just like, that's the guy.
You have to just show up at his readings like totally cosplayed as a priest too, and just like sit there. Like
all you got to do is one little call, and you're like, I am the priest from the book. You didn't read the book. You should have read the book.
I'm Father MacLeod.
Well, and I loved the fact, like you said, you didn't have to do any research, but for anybody who's ever bought a house, so like I joke, it's not a tutorial of how to buy a house, but obviously that features centrally in it. And then the idea of okay, this purchase of a house becomes this nightmare, and here's why, and all these things, all the chickens that are coming home to roost here. I love that, but it's like, yeah, buying a house in of itself is a nightmare. And I have a friend who just bought a house, and I have not told her I read this book because she'd be like, would you stop?
Like, what do you know about the people who used to own the house?
Exactly.
Right. One of the assistant editors who worked on this book. Yeah, one of the assistant editors who worked on this book told me that she and her husband were looking to buy a new house while she was working on this book, and the book convinced them to just refinance what they already had.
Yeah, it's better to just stay put.
But it's funny because I say I didn't do any research. I had to do some research because there are elements.
Because I'm assuming you're not fluent in Russian.
I'm not fluent in Russian. I had a friend of mine who grew up in Moscow. She helped me with all the Russian. And it was actually very funny because she's a very sweet person who doesn't swear, and I have the Russian characters in this book saying absolutely vile shit.
Yeah, so my husband's Russian, so I recognize, and he has only taught me really vile things to
That's
say.
what you recognize, yeah.
So I was like, oh, I recognize that word.
I was going to say, Bracken, next time you need Russians to swear, call Jennifer's husband, because he will probably not be upset about saying those things, and you don't have to upset your friends.
It was a fun afternoon sitting around the dinner table with my friend Katya and the manuscript in front of me and being like, okay, so how would he say?
Yeah.
I would never.
And she's just like, oh, Bracken, I cannot even say that.
Yeah. I won't say my one Russian phrase that I know, but my husband thought it would be absolutely hysterical to teach me a really, really filthy phrase that he told me was, thank you for inviting me into your home. It's beautiful. And he wanted me to say this to his parents. No! Luckily, way back then, they didn't speak to me because they called me a demon witch whore.
Well, yeah.
But now they've come around and they finally like me. So the last time we visited, I was like, this is the phrase I know that your son taught me. And I said it, and they were like, Roman, why would you make her say those words?
Because I think there is that phrase or that tendency to be, when you have knowledge of another language, the thing you want to share is the bad stuff. So I know very little Hebrew, but when I was in swim in high school, I was taught all the bad words by my friend who was newly from Jewish school and was like, I have non-Jewish friends now. What can I teach them? It's like, that's what I need to share. I'm like, all right.
I remember in high school, I was friends with a foreign exchange student who was he was from I think he was from Denmark, right? And he loved swearing in English, absolutely loved.
Who doesn't?
Right, and so he would just say like the most assaultive, vile things to you, just casually. As like way of greeting. And it was the best, because by the time I got to high school, when I was younger, I lived in Southern California, in San Diego, and then we moved when I was older up to Idaho, and it was this very sort of like small conservative religious town.
I'm
and
sorry.
They were scared, and because it was a Mormon town, a lot of people would creatively swear, so they'd say like, feck or
cheese and rice.
Yeah, cheese. And he'd lay out, and he'd be like, Bracken, your mother fucks like a greyhound in heat.
You're like, why?
Like, I don't even know what really that means, but okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Like really fast is what I'm picturing it.
Honestly,
and bony.
Knowing nothing else about your life. I mean, I know you said that you ended up as a writer because all these other things you didn't nail the way you wanted to nail. But I can see why you're a horror writer, because having to go from San Diego, which is one of the most beautiful, amazing places to live, to a little conservative town in Idaho, seems like I have just been moved to hell, the seventh layer of hell. Please let me
really
out
rough
of it.
Transition, because I was a kid who.
Were you a goth kid back then?
So it was a little. I ended up being a goth kid later in high school, and in college as an adaptation, because when I got because in Idaho I was a punk kid, like, so I had bleached white hair that stuck up this high, and and all this stuff, and I was and ears pierced and the whole thing, and I was the only kid in the entire town who looked like this. As a matter, I remember parents actually went to the school and demanded like the principal expel me because they were afraid that I was going to like hurt
Oh
them.
my
that
God.
I was a danger.
Because was it like Satanic Panic time too?
Yeah,
Was it
no,
like
it's right
late 80s?
But I mean, that was going on into the 90s and stuff because so my older sister, she was in California and worked for Borders back when there was a Borders, and she got moved by her boss to open a store in Boise. And at the time, she had like magenta hair and stuff, and she didn't look super punk, but literally she told us she was only there for maybe a year and was like, please get me the hell out of here. But she would go to a restaurant and people would come out of the kitchen to look at her like they had never seen.
That girl has pink hair.
She has weird hair. That's brilliant. Look at that. And it was just, not a good time in her life. And
it was definitely a tough move, and it taught me a lot of things about people. The reason I didn't get expelled was because one teacher who taught a class that was it was called Basic Law, right? Yes. He knew that I was a good, and he stood up for me and explained to these people, he explained to them basically that all of the kids that end up, and oh, by the way, Regina's Tarot and Witchcraft is absolutely right about that. We can talk about that in a second, but he was like, look, all the kids that get expelled from this school for drugs and fighting and all this stuff, they're the normal looking kids.
Yeah, it's not this guy.
Happened, as were on me because I was impossible not to see because I stood out so much. So there was no in any kind of trouble because all eyes were always on me.
Yeah.
And he was like, this kid can't get away with anything if he wanted to.
Yeah, we would have been a mile away. And Regina says, I'm not convinced the Satanic Panic ever truly went away. I think it's just kind of morphed. Well, yeah, now we're scared of drag queens reading to children. And
we're scared of drag queens. We're scared of books. We're scared of science.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's a bathroom.
There's a fantastic book by a cultural anthropologist, I think is what he is officially, or maybe he's a psychologist. Anyways, Stanley Cohen in the 60s wrote a book called Folk Devils. And he was examining at the time the cultural phenomenon of like mods and rockers in England, sort of pre-skinhead culture, like, and the original skinheads, like the Jamaican influence, ska sort of. Anyways, and he had this theory that that they don't go away; they just kind of morph into whatever social ill society wants to put on these people. So if you're afraid of crime, you're afraid of these the mods and rockers over here who are violent and obviously lawless and do drugs. If you're afraid of the devil, then here are the metalheads and the kids playing Dungeons and Dragons. If you're, and today what it is, if you're afraid of people who it so often falls on children as the target because everyone wants to support saving children, right? If you want to be opposed to people who are abusive toward children, well, then you find the groomers, right? And they're always the people that you can't miss. Yeah. Right? Because that's the easiest one to demonize. That's the easiest.
And they're never the
trans people and and you go, okay, these are obviously the perverts in our society who are in danger.
Because look at them with all their tattoos and piercings.
Exactly. But
they listen to weird music that obviously is going to make them molest my kid.
Yeah. The real threat to most children comes from within their circle of trust. Yep. Parents, coaches, extended family.
The youth pastors. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I worked for the Boy Scouts, and part of the reason we had such stringent leadership training about 2D leadership and all this stuff is because of the stuff that had happened where these people who were trusted leaders did that. And I mean, most groups have tried to do what they can to prevent people from ever being alone with children that aren't theirs, but it still happens. And it's never true.
That's the thing about the circle of trust, right? If you wanted to victimize, let's say you wanted to victimize kids, all right, would you become a garbage collector?
No.
Or a priest, right? I mean, it's obvious which one gives you authority, trust, and alone time.
And alone time with kids.
With your intended victim. If you're a garbage collector, you're never going to get the opportunity to do this nefarious thing that you want to do.
No, exactly. No, right. I would be a Little League coach because I don't want to have to go to seminary and learn Greek because I think that's
because I'm lazy.
If you're inclined to steal $1 million, you don't become a school teacher, you become an investment.
I was going to say, school teachers aren't getting anywhere near $1 million.
Exactly.
I feel like school teachers get paid negative $30,000 a year.
Well, it's true. I mean, part of it, I mean, my husband goes back to school tomorrow, so I say this in all the, look at the mug, teachers, blah, okay. But I mean, yeah, because half of them have to spend their own money for their own supplies and all this stuff, and it's true. But beyond that, and again, the too deep leadership is like a huge thing, and if people did that, that would be so much more helpful. But instead of looking at people, they look different, so let's judge them and assume the worst. There are bad things that happen to kids referenced in your book.
And it's also easy to blame marginalized people who don't have the social power to stand up for them. You know, if you blame metalheads and D&D nerds in the 80s, I mean, we had no social power whatsoever.
No, we did not.
We don't have any now.
And so,
like, as opposed to now, when us D&D
well,
nerds are like, I got all the power.
Now you've got, like, you know,
this is the problem right here. Sorry, I'm just grabbing crap off my husband's desk.
And people with a real platform who could stand up and defend themselves, you know, on Twitter or whatever. But back then, there was none of that. And this is what you're talking about. You know, when you frame trans people as a threat to children, like, what kind of social power, you know, does this group actually have? Do they have a big pulpit where they can just go on the TV anytime and defend themselves? No, they're just decent people trying to live their lives for the most part. You know, there's always going to be some asshole in every group, but the fact is, they're just like you and me. They're trying to live their lives. They're trying to.
Yeah.
Or as Regina says, if you're afraid of pee, because that's what they're doing in the bathroom, is they're peeing.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, and I did mumble under my breath there that there are some bad things that happen to children in your book, but they don't happen like in your book. So
they're just
like, something that's like a bothersome thing, that it shouldn't be an issue to anybody, because there aren't any children that are really in the book. It's all bad adults being bad adults.
Yeah.
Adult on adult violence.
I know we lost you again.
Shake your computer. Do a Fonzie.
Shake your computer. Yeah, just like punch the computer like it's an old jukebox.
Dance break. Which is dance break. Oh, now we're voguing. This is why Jennifer is the dance instructor, because she's like all beautiful, and I'm like, Muppet. Just doing that. Yeah, no, well, Jennifer. Bracken's book, it has multiple storylines of all the Yeah, and Regina says we need to slap Mercury out of retrograde for Bracken's computer too. No, but like there's multiple storylines of adults doing adult things related to jobs and the house and all this stuff that all converge. But there are children as like backstory characters, but you don't ever hear or see anything.
Yeah, I'm glad that was. I don't want to say glossed over, but it wasn't.
No,
we didn't hear the details.
As history and background and motivation, but it's a line for me as a writer. Like, I get asked all the time, like, is there a line you won't cross? And the line I won't cross, being a survivor of child sexual abuse, is I don't depict child abuse in my work. Now, it's in there because because it happens, and it
happens. And honestly, there's nothing more horrifying.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes for the character, it's in their backstory, it's motivating, it's a reason why they make choices that they do. But I don't need to raise consciousness about child abuse by depicting it, because everybody already knows.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we've been having this conversation since the 80s, right? What's an important element to put in the book is how that affects people into adulthood, or how that affects the kind of choices that people make in their lives that lead to bad outcomes. And so just writing a page where somebody's, slapping a kid around, I have no interest in it, because I don't think it provides any insight into the phenomenon.
Right. I mean, it's more important to get inside either character's head.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that person? Why do they think they have to slap this kid around?
Right.
What makes that villain tick?
Yeah, I have a similar issue with like depictions of adult sexual assault. Right? Because I don't think you shouldn't be able to write about it. I think it absolutely needs to be confronted. but it shouldn't be confronted in a way that's titillating or that is
glorifying it
or whatever. I mean,
or even making it seem like it's not that big a deal.
And some of them do it very well, and some of them just do it terribly, and but and so it's tricky. So I always try to maneuver around these issues in a way that is, hopefully, if I'm successful, gives you some insight into people and their experiences, as opposed to just being, well, if this guy sexually assaults her, then he's clearly a victim.
Yeah.
There are so many ways to establish that somebody's a bad person without doing a big long.
Well, and I think one of the things you handled really well is you got in multiple people's heads here, and you could see, I mean, not for every character that was there, but there were multiple people that we would see, this is why they were making the choices they made, and this is why they reacted the way they did. Even if us, having read somebody else's point of view, are thinking, this person is horrible, and then we see their take on themselves, and they're not horrible. They're justified in feeling this way.
Yeah, they don't feel like they're horrible, but they're still gross.
And even if we're like, oh, hearing why you think you aren't horrible makes me realize how horrible you really are.
Horrible you
really are.
Yeah, no.
Like,
any minute that you spend inside Mac's head in that book,
that I wanted to do an eye and ear wash.
They're not thoughts that I have on my own without sort of having to force myself into that space.
That's good to know.
But I did want to depict him as a real person. With a motivation, with a grudge. He's sort of a stand-in for toxic masculinity and incel culture, and and the idea of male entitlement. This book is all about male entitlement, and that he feels like he can have everything he feels like he deserves, that life has.
Right. He deserves the mistress and the wife and the house.
Exactly. And a house and a dog that loves him, and and all of this stuff, and when he's denied it, right?
They'll see.
It strikes at his very kind of core, like his identity is the things he owns, right? And so that's kind of the point of view I needed him to have.
I mean, he was really, really gross. But I felt like he was an actual person and not like a mustache twirling caricature of like, I'm the crazy man. I'm like, oh no.
There are other characters in the book who end up kind of appearing more like forces of nature, and that's intentional as well.
Right. And I was going to say, I liked the fact that you even got us inside his wife's head, because sometimes we end up going, well, why did she ever marry that guy? I mean, didn't she know? And the fact that you handled it perfectly in saying, he was a certain way during the courtship period, and then things started changing, and
that is what happens.
And I feel like even not in abusive relationships, just in normal relationships, that just happens, where everyone's doing their best, and then when you're locked in and now you're stuck with this person, and yes, you could possibly leave, but there's a lot of what would you have to give up to leave?
Well, right. Now that we're married, I can stop going to church. Now that we're married, I'm going to get X, Y, Z that I never got before. And it's like, no, now that you're married, it's exactly the same.
You should be the same person.
You should be the same person.
Right. Yeah. But now you're in this, in this legal partnership. And and it is it's a weird mythology. I think that it probably strikes all people, but I think men a little bit more, probably a lot more, is this idea that once I'm married, I can be my true self. Because I can, and it's like, you should have been your true self from the first.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you, Bracken.
Yeah, and I think you also hear things about like saying one partner thinks the other one will change, another one is hoping the other one won't, and everybody does change, but it's those expectations, and hearing just, oh, this person expected to get this out of life or that out of life, and then when that didn't happen, what their reaction was. But Regina says the POV sections were crazy scary, and they were, because we weren't just in one person's head, and I like that we moved without, and we also weren't always just in the moment of when things start going wrong. We see how they led up to it, but I felt you did a really good job of keeping the tension throughout by doing that, because you'd leave somebody in the basement, and then it's like, now they're looking at houses, and it's like.
I also loved seeing the same scene from different point of views. Like, so what's happening in the basement versus what's happening in the prints room, you know, like it's, do you have a prints room? Do you have
no, we don't. We have the room I'm sitting in, we call the gray room.
Oh, that's not nearly as eloquent as
the walls are great. It's not nearly as eloquent, but I thought it had a little bit more cheeky humor to have a purple. That's the Prince room.
Well, that not being able to have somebody else instantly know that it's the Prince room because it's purple. That's
an easy cultural shorthand. You mentioned Prince, purple is immediately
exactly like the second it was like the Prince room, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's purple. I'm like, it's purple, and then I was like, oh, my fainting couch would look great in there. It's like dumb me decorating your imaginary house,
which is funny because
I have a chaise lounge in the other room.
Of course. So. Is it purple? I'm like, because mine's
it's purple. It's gross.
Oh. Well, and Jen, then you can be the dream wife who wants to do the home decorating business.
Oh God, I don't think anybody's ever called me a dream wife in my life, including my husband.
You're the dream wife. You're the dream wife. Absolutely are.
He's like, oh yeah, in a way.
Dream wife.
Dreams, nightmares. I mean, everybody has a different way.
And so Bracken, so this book has already come out. Are you working on something else right now?
Yes, that was.
I'm working on something else. I've been working on a book for a couple of years that I'm actually taking a pause on because I generally have a rule that is once I start a project, I can't do anything else until I finish that project. Like I must finish everything I've started.
I wish I could.
Yeah, right. But I'm kind of in a place where this, and I've kept to that pretty well for everything. But I'm in a place with this book that I've been working on where I'm not quite sure how to end it, so I need to set it aside. I have an outline for another book that I'm working on right now. So I've got a couple of irons in the fire. One of them is about the Satanic Panic and sort of the effects, long-term effects of it over.
I'm sorry, I just got so excited, but it is like
why are we so excited about that? But it's
I just it's one of my favorite because it reminds me of like my childhood, my teenage years.
Yeah, so many of us were defined by it, right? Especially if we were alternative kids.
And now we're just elder goths.
Now we're elder goths, exactly. But
yeah,
you were listening,
that's fun.
You were listening to Nitzer Ebb in the back in the day. You were just the devil. So it resounds with a people of a certain age, Gen X and older millennials, I think, who live.
We're like, us.
Or in one case, I was not the alternative kid. My sister was. So I'm like, all of this, I live vicariously through her. Like my mother telling my sister that, no, we could not listen to 9 Inch Nails on the way home from Good Friday service because that was just in poor taste. My mother let us listen to 9 Inch Nails, just not on Good Friday.
Not on the way home from service. Yeah. I got you.
Good Friday, come on.
Standards. Holiest day of the year. Sorry, I'm like, that was my Catholic school just coming out right there. Holiest day of the year.
The other thing I'm working on is a road novel that's sort of like, kind of like Sam Shepard meets Clive Barker.
Hot.
Right.
Sorry, that just burst out.
Let me get my fan.
I know, right? Oh, you give me the vapors.
I do declare.
She just went Southern, ladies and gentlemen. She just went Southern.
That's the Sam Shepard effect. Like, it just happens. It's like, oh my gosh, I hope somebody's wearing a cowboy hat. That's weird. That just happened. That's the Sazerac talking.
That is the Sazerac talking. That's what I've gotten to work, and so it's a little bit out because neither of those books are sold. They're still in progress, but
we get it.
That's our life.
Yeah. Where it's like I can kind of talk about it, but kind of not. I don't know.
No, and I got yelled at yesterday at the coffee shop, Jennifer, because one of my friends is like, when can I fight about Jennifer's secret? I'm like, not yet. No.
I feel like I'm pretty sure my agent's not watching this. I feel like I should just like start sending it to people.
If you send it to me, I can swear her to secrecy. She would be very happy if she got it.
I know. I just keep talking about like what I'm working on now because I'm like, I haven't been sworn to secrecy about my ballroom dance murder book. What?
What?
Because you should smile more. I'm just saying.
And here comes the violence. violence portion of the podcast.
I know, when Allison and I just start screaming at each other, which has never happened. It really hasn't. No. There are some times that like you have a scolding face during the podcast, and I'm like, and then when we do the screenshots, I'm like, I swear she's not screaming at me.
No, not usually.
I don't know why I look so scared. It's childhood trauma.
It's just the satanic panic.
It's the satanic panic.
It's fine.
Bracken, I hate to stop this conversation, but we are out of time.
Oh, that's a bummer. It went so fast.
It did go so fast. I know. Because we're delightful, and so are you. Everybody, please read Closing Costs by Bracken MacLeod.
A novel of suspense, or
a novel of suspense. It tells
and real estate intrigue.
And real estate intrigue.
And
also, learn your
very
Russian
few
swears.
Details on actual real estate transactions. There might be a couple in there because the lawyer in me couldn't help it.
Yes. And the lawyer in me appreciated you getting those right, because I would be the one going, that's not how things happen.
Paperwork.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like pulling down my glasses on my nose going, but that's
You did good, Bracken. You did good.
Thank you.
And Allison, you did really well by only release the Bracken one time.
I did good. I didn't even say my Highlander joke.
I was just going to say, we made it.
Let's close it.
45 minutes without
I'll close it on it.
We'll
we only have one guest on today, and may it be Bracken MacLeod.
Yeah, save the A material. Leave people wanting more.
Yes.
Where do they?
Everybody who's watching this live or watching the replay or listening to it with your ear holes, make sure you tune in next week when we have Amber Garza talking about her new book, In a Quiet Town. We will see you all next week. Bye.